Hello, welcome to the Wilson Center. For those of you who are online and here in person, thank you for joining us. I am John Thornamajuk, and I direct the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative here at the Wilson Center. The program provides evidence-based analysis that translate research into policy impact by expanding the space for new perspectives, constructive dialogue, and sustainable solution. More than 57 years ago, U.S. Congress established the Wilson Center to bridge the world of academia and the world of public policy. As a congressionally chartered think tank, our mission is to provide nonpartisan counsel and insights on global affairs to policymakers through independent research, impartial analysis, scholarship, and open dialogue, such as the one we're having today. Since the outbreak of war in Sudan on April 15, 2023, the conflict has quickly spread across the country, reigniting ethnic bloodshed in Darfur region, killing people everywhere, forcibly displacing over 11 million people, and the country is on the verge or already experiencing famine. The Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative at the Wilson Center, in partnership with the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of the Sudans and our Africa program here, convened this event to examine the dynamics of the war and interrelated consequences such as human displacement, hunger, and famine. And the goal is to chart a path forward for the new administration on this issue. Speakers will discuss the urgency of the situation, the inadequacy of the current response, and actionable recommendations on a path forward to find lasting solutions. I want to express my thoughts and sympathies for the victim of the tragedy that just happened last night here in Washington, D.C. Right now, I want to introduce Ambassador Dane Smith, who is the Executive Director of the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of the Sudans, AFRECS. It's a faith-based institution which he will briefly talk about in his remark. Ambassador Smith has a long career in the Foreign Service, but I will just mention a few. He has served as a senior advisor on Darfur in the office of the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan at the State Department. He has been a U.S. ambassador to Guinea and Senegal, and served as a special presidential envoy to Liberia. He was a deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum in the 1980s. Ambassador Smith, the podium is yours.
I want to thank first John Thornamajuk, Director of RAFDI, Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative here at the Wilson Center. Thank him for arranging this co-sponsorship between RAFDI and AFRECS of this event. AFRECS, the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of the Sudans, was created 20 years ago to support the peace-building and pastoral priorities of the Episcopal Church of Sudan. After the independence of South Sudan, we decided we should support both the Episcopal Church of Sudan and the Episcopal Church of South Sudan. And we've been providing emergency aid to these churches in both countries to feed internally displaced persons in Sudan and to aid refugees streaming into South Sudan. I've been personally wrestling with the fortunes of Sudan off and on for almost 40 years, since I was Deputy Chief of Mission beginning in 1986 in Khartoum. The civil war between North and South was raging then, and 25 years later, as John Tone mentioned, I was called out of retirement to work on Darfur. I labored to craft with the government of Qatar an agreement to end fighting in Darfur and secure legitimacy of rule. We did create such an agreement, but only one of the parties signed on to it. And then, of course, the government of Sudan did not implement it, just as we had warned they probably would not. That was yet another failure to recognize and smooth the way for a peace that recognizes the vast diversity of Sudan and the imperative of legitimate civilian government. Now we have the worst crisis ever in Sudan, which has killed 150,000, has displaced 11.5 million in the country and sent more than 3 million across neighboring borders. There is widespread famine and starvation. The U.S. government has charged the Rapid Support Forces with genocide and the Sudan Armed Forces on 2 occasions with using chemical weapons against the RSF and also with indiscriminate bombing of civilians and pursuing starvation as a weapon of war. The U.S. government has proclaimed the Sudan situation to be the worst humanitarian situation in the world. That is, friends, ahead of Gaza, ahead of Ukraine, ahead of Haiti, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And despite a clear understanding, I believe, of the Sudan situation, the U.S. has failed, along with other partners, African, Arab, and European, to make progress toward peace. That's in spite of what I would call the heroic and indefatigable efforts by Special Sudan Envoy Tom Piorello. There's been some movement ahead on the humanitarian side, but not on the peace side. So today we're bringing you a presentation by experts, not only to spell out the horrors of Sudan and its multifaceted impact on the region, but also to identify policies to push Sudan toward a just peace. And I'd like to thank all the people who are participating today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Smith. And now we are going to go to the program. And before that, a few housekeeping items. One, please silence your phones or turn them off so that they don't disrupt. The run-up show, we will have a moderated discussion, and then we will have, toward the end, a few questions from the audience. We have online audience, and we have in-person audience. So let me briefly introduce the speakers. You have their bios in front of you, but I will just quickly go through and then start the conversation. As you can tell, we have 3 virtual speakers from around the world. So let me start with Dr. Rogeya Mustafa Abu Sharaf. She's a professor of anthropology at Georgetown University in Qatar. She is the author of so many books, including Darfur Allegory and Transforming Displaced Women in Sudan, Politics and the Body in a Squatter Settlement. She writes about culture, politics, anthropology of gender, human rights, migration and diaspora issues in Sudan, the Gulf, Oman, Zanzibar, and the Indian Ocean. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Abu Sharaf. And then on the screen is also Dr. Rebecca Glett, who is a visiting professor, a visiting researcher at the Makerere Institute of Social Science at Makerere University in Uganda, where she is also a managing editor of the Makerere Historical Journal. She received her PhD in African history at Columbia University, where she wrote her dissertation titled Sudanese Political Movements and Struggle for the State from 1964 to 1985. She recently co-authored a report entitled Research in Displacement, the Impact of War on Sudan's Higher Education and Academic Research Community, which she will briefly mention. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us. On the screen also is Dr. Nesrine Lamine, who is also a professor, assistant professor of anthropology and African studies at the University of Toronto in Canada. She received her BA in Socio-Political Development Studies from Harvard University and PhD in Anthropology from Stanford University. Dr. Elamin spent over a decade working as an educator, researcher, and organizer in the United States and Tanzania. She is a member of the Sudan Solidarity Collective, which has been supporting local emergency response rooms in Sudan since the wake of the war, and she will briefly talk about that. Thanks for joining us. And I know it's night in Qatar and also in Uganda, so thank you. Here in the studio, we have Guy Joseph in the middle here. He is an international human rights law student at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. Born in the Darfur region of Sudan, Guy was displaced by war and found asylum in Israel and eventually in the United States. After graduating from the College of Lake County in Chicago in 2016, he attended Harvard University, where he studied international human rights law and worked for the Africa Policy Journal at the Kennedy School of Government as a co-managing editor. His experience includes working as a translator to help victims tell their stories to the court. He also worked as a humanitarian director for Bani Darfur organization, legal assistant for Project Expedite Justice, and student ambassador, among others. Welcome, Guy. Next is Dr. Alex DeWall. He is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation and research professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He has worked on the Horn of Africa, famine, conflict-related issue since the 1980s, and is a prominent scholar on these subjects. And Dr. DeWall has written so many books, and including Mass Starvation, the History and Future of Famine, and Sudan's Unfinished Democracy, the Promise and Betrayal of a People's Revolution. Welcome, Dr. DeWall. Next is Thomas Stahl, who is a member of the American Friend of the Episcopal Church of Sudan. Tom is a retired long-time career professional. He has a long career in the humanitarian sector. He retired from the U.S. Agency for International Development in 2019 as a counselor. He started as an emergency program officer in Khartoum, Sudan, in the aftermath of the East Africa famine of the mid-1980s. Then he became a deputy director of the Food for Peace Office covering Ethiopia, Sudan, Uganda, and Somalia. Prior to his work with USAID, Tom was the country representative for World Vision International in Sudan. He holds degrees from Hope College, Columbia University, and the National Defense University. Welcome, Mr. Stahl. So these are our speakers. Now we'll go to the discussion, and I will ask each of the speakers to limit the remarks to 3 to 5 minutes. So let's start with our diligent speakers that are on the screen. And Nasreen, let me start with you. Could you set the stage for us? How did Sudan descend into this war? You were in the country when the fight broke out in 2023. So walk out through, and in addition to that question, you can have your opening statement in the next 3 to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me. So I would say the trigger for this war is often reduced to a disagreement over security sector reform, but its root causes are obviously much more structural and historical. In my view, this is really an internationalized counter-revolutionary war, as opposed to, say, a proxy war or simply an internal power struggle between two generals, which is typically how it's been framed. I think, the proxy war framing is compelling, but it tends to obscure the decades-long role that Sudanese military and business elites have played in kind of laying the foundation for this war, and it minimizes their responsibility in leading it. And so, to me, this war is meant to protect the interests of Sudanese elites and their international partners. It's meant to preserve the Sudanese state in its current militarized formation and to prevent civilian rule and certainly a popular democracy from the bottom up, as we saw it articulated by revolutionaries in the years leading up to this war. And if we understand this war as a counter-revolutionary war, and in particular if we understand the counter-revolutionary element as being co-produced by Sudanese elites and their international partners, then I think we can trace its origins back to the transitional period, right, when the backbone and sort of grassroots constituency of the revolution that consisted of, approximately 8,000 neighborhood resistance committees, but also various labor, feminist, and youth formations were sidelined during the formation of a transitional government in favor of civilian elites, many from the diaspora, who focused on opening Sudan up after decades of isolation due to Clinton-era sanctions to international donor funding. And the transitional government power was always kind of tilted in favor of military elites, which precluded political reforms and led civilian elites to kind of turn outwards, to focus on neoliberal reforms that deepened the existing economic crisis, rather than remaining inwardly focused on the demands that kind of continued to emerge from the streets. And ironically, many of these reforms were imposed on Sudan by international actors like the United States in exchange for being removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, while continuing the same kinds of IMF-recommended policies that had triggered the revolution. The issue of land reform was, in my view, a key issue that was mostly ignored and sidelined during the transition, despite rural farmers and herders making specific demands of the state to restructure the agricultural sector and to undo the havoc that almost 2 decades of Bashir-era privatization policies had wrought on rural communities and livelihoods. And I'm going to focus on Central Sudan because that's where I do my research, but of course this applies to the rest of the country as well. There's a large farmers' union in the agricultural Jazeera region, for example, that met with civilian elites from the transitional government during, several times, and they laid out very clear plans on how to reverse the damage caused by a set of laws passed in 2005 in consultation with the World Bank that was aimed at dismantling and privatizing the Jazeera scheme, which used to be one of the largest centrally managed irrigation schemes in the world, and selling off all of its productive assets to the highest bidders. And they were entirely ignored. And so if you look also at any of the key documents produced during the transition, the issue of land, food sovereignty, struggles over land were largely ignored despite how critical they are to any kind of sustainable peace. And so I'll end here by saying that in October of 2021, the army and RSF together orchestrated a military coup, driven partly by concerns that the companies they control would fall under civilian oversight. These included companies that dominate key sectors of Sudan's urban and rural economy, such as construction, dairy, cement, gold, wheat, gum arabic, and livestock. And after the coup, we saw UN-led peace talks, led by the US, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the UK, prop up the coup leaders, Burhan and Hemeti, framing them as potential reformists who could steer Sudan back towards the somewhat flawed process that was meant to result in democratic elections before the coup, rather than heeding the call of the resistance committees who called for no negotiations, no legitimacy, and no partnership with the military. And I think these internationally mediated peace talks really absolved Burhan and Hemeti of their war crimes that spanned decades and rewarded them for the agreements that they had broken over the decades. And this lack of accountability and international diplomats prioritizing stability, or rather stable military rule over revolutionary demands and popular democracies, in my view, partly what paved the way for this war. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You said the context. And Rogea, I'm going to go to you too. One of the immediate aftermaths of any war is human displacement. And right now, Sudan has been described as the largest internal displacement in the world. And this is a group that includes women and children, among others. And you have written about this and walk us through the state of human displacement as we speak. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, John. I can't thank you enough for bringing up this conversation about a war that has been forgotten and sidelined. I would also like to thank the Friends, the American Friends of the Episcopal Church, for caring. And I'd like also to say hi to Guy, whom I very delighted to know that he joined Georgetown Law School Georgetown is my other home in Washington, so my heart also goes out to the families of the tragic event of last night, yesterday. And for Alex, a great friend from whom Darfur allegory wouldn't have been possible without who are the Darfurians and famine that kills. So thank you, everybody. With respect to the issue of the scale of displacement, again, it is not shocking, which is an unfortunate thing to say. It is not shocking that in a state that reproduced every negativity in the colonial project into the future, it wasn't shocking because South Sudan has endured genocide, massive displacement, dislocation, and extreme violence, senseless violence. Darfur, in the same way, since 2003, and in Dr. Dual's work even before that. So the writing on the wall was all too clear. When April 15th happened, I don't know why people were shocked and what they expected an outcome to be when you empower what Nelson Casfier calls rebel governance. I agree with everything that my dear colleague Nasreen has said. I think she set the stage. So there is no, I don't want to go to the roots, but we want to talk about the scale of sexual violence. This is, of course, since you're here, I am sure that you are aware of Amnesty International reports, human rights reports. Khartoum is not a safe place for women and girls. In Al Jazeera as well. In Al Jazeera, the fact that they had somebody from the Janjaweed, from the militia, who meted out atrocities against civilians on behalf, as an important member of the militia of the Janjaweed, and then with the taking over by the government, by the army, and the atrocities also meted against South Sudanese brothers who happen to be in Al Jazeera. I don't think that this needs to be taken lightly. It is not a matter of number. It is not a matter of statistics. These are lives that continue to be devalued. And this is, I think, something that we need to talk about. Right now with displacement, it is becoming extremely difficult for people. Of course, with, let's say, people going to Egypt or people crossing to Gadarif, or it is incredible. It is really almost impossible for people to find a way. And even just hearing Al Jazeera Mubashir, which is Al Jazeera Direct, they have 1 hour dedicated from 7 to 8, my time here in Qatar, to the Forgotten War. And they bring people from both sides, people from Taqaddum, from the Sudanese Coordination of Civil Democratic Forces, and everybody seems to be so undemocratic, even in the span of 50 minutes of conversation. And so that reminded me of a very important architect, an environmental activist. When they asked him about the environmental and the climate crisis, he said it is an attitude problem. So I think what is happening is an attitude problem, a mindset problem. Nasreen is absolutely right about elite formation, elite interests, international actors, lack of accountability. So as far as the displacement, it will continue. I just read a report earlier in preparation for this conversation about Chad. deporting some people, refugees from Darfur, to send them back to the hell that the Janjaweed and the army are both complicit in and perpetrate. So I think that it's just a situation that doesn't give anybody any hope or any horizon for a semblance of normalcy. And I sorry to end with such pessimistic thought,
Thank you.
but
Thank you. And
thank
this
you
is
so much.
the gravity of the situation we are trying to paint before we talk about what needs to be done. And continue with the topic of the humanitarian and displacement. I want to bring in Rebecca too, who has done that research, the report about the impact of war on Sudan higher education and academic research community. How do Sudanese higher education institutions continue to operate despite the significant displacement of students and faculty and destruction of critical facilities for instruction? If you could sit your opening and answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me and for hosting this important conversation. I'm really honored to be here. When this war broke out, it was both not a surprise, but it also kind of caught everyone off guard at the same time. And this is across the board, but also at universities. There were students taking exams at University of Khartoum at 9 a.m. on the Saturday when the war broke out. And as Khartoum and later other cities became sites of combat, this meant that the campuses and university infrastructure became basically unreachable, including for student records and university servers. We know that some university facilities like the Mohammed Omar Bashir Center for Sudan Studies at Umdurman Ahliya University were destroyed entirely. Others will be in better shape, but we really won't know the entire extent of the damage to higher education infrastructure until this war ends. At the same time, these institutions have kept on in the face of massive impediments. The displacement then that's been mentioned at current point is like 12.5 million people displaced, with over 3 million outside of Sudan. And I'm sure we'll discuss the food insecurity and the violence further as well. But the question of how to reach students and faculty in the context of this is really a massive challenge. And institutions have been doing their best, but in the face of it. The Ministry of Higher Education relocated its operations first to Medani and then Port Sudan, and has preserved important backups of key university records, especially dates of registration and dates of degrees awarded for students across the country. They're subject to the priorities of a government controlled by the military, which limits their abilities to act in certain ways while also remaining an important resource for universities at a very difficult moment. Many universities have found ways of going forward with online teaching. First, University of Khartoum, then other universities instituted remote teaching. In many cases, this involved lectures using WhatsApp or Telegram, Google Meets at times, and even PowerPoints and PDFs sent to students in groups to teach remotely. Universities have sought backup records from the Ministry of Higher Education, though those are limited, and it's a huge impediment for students and graduates to access university records. Final exams have been happening at testing sites in key locations in Sudan, in Port Sudan, Kasada, Atbara, among others, as well as at testing sites in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. For students in Sudan, this involves travel to the testing sites most often, which can be both dangerous and expensive, meaning that to get to the exams and be able to advance is a real struggle. Then these exams are intense. Students are often sitting for 2 semesters worth of exams all at once, meaning they're taking 2 exams a day for like 2 weeks in an attempt to graduate while after having secured housing in a new location. Not all areas are equally affected, nor are all universities. Most universities in Khartoum were displaced and are teaching remotely, usually after individual colleges are able to reach 50 or 60% of their students. Universities in the East and North have been able to continue in-person classes at times. Then in Darfur and in Jazeera, university facilities were entirely destroyed often or disrupted massively, and frequent internet blockades, poor network, and perilous conditions have meant that far less teaching has gone on, though I've heard of online classes in Al-Fashir University, even in the midst of all this. All of this is done for concern for institutions, not money. Both faculty and students are facing massive threats to their safety and well-being given the conditions across the country. And on top of that, after the outbreak of war, the Ministry of Finance started paying university lecturers in arrears 60% of their normal salaries. These salaries are in Sudanese pounds, which has also been massively devalued. So it's 60% of an already devalued salary. Universities where activity is not ongoing have had their salaries discontinued. So even that support is gone for some universities in Darfur. So when faculty are teaching, they're not doing it for just for some basic income. Often they're doing it because it's a choice of doing so or leaving their students with no ability to graduate. So it's a grim situation, but people are working hard to do their best in the face of real challenges.
Thank you, and that resilience is still there. Tom, let me come to you on the humanitarian. You have worked in that sector for a long time, and especially in Sudan, where you start in the emergency situations. And the confluence of war, displacement, and hunger, what, for our audience, what are the immediate basic needs? You went there when you were USAID, and US is a leader in humanitarian funding. But what are really the immediate needs that the outsiders need to know?
Yeah, thank you. As you've mentioned, and Ambassador Smith mentioned, this is the largest humanitarian disaster in the world. And in terms of the numbers of people at famine level and on the brink of famine, it's actually more than all the other disasters in the world combined. So it's a huge problem. And to do a successful humanitarian operation, you need a couple of things. First of all, you need the resources, money, food, whatever. Secondly, you need access. You need to be able to get the supplies there and manage the distribution. And these are the huge problems in Sudan. Resources are not what was required in terms of the appeal, but the problem is more that we can't get it there anyway. The U.S. has actually donated over $2 billion worth of humanitarian assistance. Other donors have done pretty well. The bigger problem is access. Access both in terms of the physical ability to get there because of the war, because of actual fighting and danger. Most of the humanitarian workers have had to leave the country, both international and local in many cases. And when they try to get food in, often it's stolen, looted, or whatever, and then out of the warehouses and so on. But the needs are across the board. Food, obviously, is a huge need, but it's not just food. You've got over 12 million people displaced. Therefore, you need shelter, you need water. Very importantly, as others have mentioned, there's a really high rate of sexual violence. So you need protection, you need trauma healing, those kind of issues to support people there. And in order to do that, you need to be there. And that's our big problem, trying to get there both in both sides, the areas controlled by the Rapid Support Forces and the areas controlled by the Sudan Armed Forces. They're blocking the aid as well as the actual physical fighting with all kinds of bureaucratic requirements, whether it's visas, permits, and so on, to go from Port Sudan to Khartoum with a load of supplies. You first need to get all the permits, which may take weeks or months, and then there are 40-some checkpoints along the way, which require all kinds of more permits, bribes, and so on. And that's in an area that's relatively secure. So you can imagine how much worse it is in the places where there's fighting. So we're just not able to get the supplies there. Maybe we can talk a little more later about some suggestions on how we could do a better job, both in terms of reducing the risk to fighters, to the workers, and also doing a better job of trying to work within the limitations you have to get the supplies there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And that's the meat of the discussion. Will come later on in the discussion. Changing gear, Alex, this month the U.S. government determined that genocide is taking place in Sudan and has sanctioned leaders of RSF and SAF. Explain what this designation means and what is next after a genocide is declared.
So the situation of the designations that the Biden administration made in its last few weeks in office echo those that the George W. Bush administration made in 2004. But the context is totally different. There was a very high level of executive attention to Sudan at that time. There was an attempt to get a coordinated approach across the United States, the United Nations, the African Union, and other key players. And we didn't have at that time, we didn't have the Gulf players as major actors. The International Criminal Court was in good standing with the United States then. It is not so now. So it's a very different circumstance. And I would say that in order to understand what the options are and what these means, the beginning point is to define the problem. And in fact, part of the difficulty with what was done 20 years ago was the problem was not fully defined. It was far-reaching and ambitious policies were adopted, but they were not fully coordinated at a policy level, even at a conceptual level. And a few years later, after that, 2009, I joined the African Union high-level panel, first for Darfur and then for Sudan. And our chair, President Thabo Mbeki, said our first duty is to define the problem, and asked, what do the Darfurians see as the problem? And what do the Sudanese more broadly see as the problem? And a number of issues came out of that. A viable state, economically viable, democratic, able to choose its own future. Governance of diversity, the status of Darfur within Sudan. The Darfur conflict was the Sudanese conflict in Darfur, not an isolated conflict in Darfur. What we've seen since then is some additional elements coming in. The Red Sea arena rivalry between particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia and others being manifest in Sudan, in those countries actually playing a role in sponsoring the belligerents. I thought Nasreen's point was absolutely spot on, but I would say we have two parallel competing counter-revolutions. We have the counter-revolution of what I might call the 1821 state, the state established in Khartoum by the colonial powers, and you have the counter-revolution of what you might call the transnational commercial security war machine of the RSF, which sees itself as actually as bigger than the Sudanese state. It will swallow the Sudanese state. It will put that state in its pocket. And they actually is there, and there is a difference between the two, but they share that same commitment to the supremacy of an elite that has no real interest in the well-being of the people. And here I think we need to also look beyond the term genocide, which is a bit limited, and look at what actual mass starvation as an instrument, not just of war, but of societal policy means. Because what it means, and this goes actually in many ways back to the doctoral research I did in Darfur in the 1980s, is actually not so much killing people, though that is important, but dismantling society, uprooting society, displacing people, internalizing, inflicting societal trauma so that society is, as it were, dismembered and then reconstituted in the image of those who are the perpetrators and the beneficiaries of mass starvation. And sexual and gender-based violence and mass displacement and mass land alienation are intrinsic to this. It's not like they are just they are different aspects of a war, sort of accidental products of war. They're actually intrinsic to this. And I would say even genocide in the way that we have seen it perpetrated in Dar Masalit is part of this broader picture. So the instruments that we have at the moment are terribly weak. We don't have that level of coordination that existed between the UN, the AU, IGAD, the United States, even bringing in China, that happened at the time of the independence of South Sudan, where you could rely on the African Union to take a political lead, the United Nations to provide peacekeepers and other resources, the United States to back that up with high-level political and diplomatic attention that would make sure everybody else was either in line or not obstructing or not vetoing. Instead, we have a sort of variable geometry of bilateral transactional politics going on, and nobody is really capable of squaring that circle. I think we recognize that the first step is to get those Middle Eastern sponsors to come to the table and agree, either to agree on a formula or to agree to stand back. But that isn't going to solve the problem. The Sudanese have to solve this problem. And then the other problem that we have, and this is my last point, is that in the past we could always rely on the Sudanese to come together and talk. No matter how deep the suffering, there was a capacity among the Sudanese to meet and talk something into existence. And what I fear we're seeing now is that is broken. And there are people who simply will not talk to each other. And there's many reasons for this, including social media, including the depth of the atrocities inflicted on urban Sudan, on the three towns that has not happened before for well over a century. So I think we're in a really a very, very difficult phase. So thank you.
Thank you. Guy, you were a victim and a survivor of the Darfur genocide that happened more than 20 years ago. And here, history is repeating itself. There's another genocide declared by the US government. As someone who was and still has those memories, what is your reaction to this declaration of genocide again, and what it means for those who have been also survivors of that? The first one.
Thank you a lot, and thank you for hosting us. In my view, the war and the genocide that's currently happening is not a surprise to me personally, because I lived in it, I escaped through it, from it, and I'm still seeing it happening. And from this stage, I would like to take a time to thank late General Colin Powell, who brought the atrocities that was happening in Sudan to the global stage. And that's how the world got to know that there was a genocide happening in Darfur. It is funny sometimes after we were forced to leave Darfur and flee to Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan, we were told that there is no genocide and this is just a propaganda, and nobody believed that. So what's happening right now in the center is to me is normal. Not that I accept what's happening, but it's not a surprise. And it sounds sometimes that like it is a systematic way of destroying generation in a way that government of Sudan understands. And it's just sad that we're here again in 2025 talking about genocide. And we always said never again and never again, but the same word, we keep repeating it. I don't know, maybe we're either lying to ourselves or there is something playing us. Those are only my kind of interpretation to the continuation of genocide. There is that, and also what pains me the most is the people who are currently struggling internally in Darfur and all over Sudan, dying on the daily basis, and there is no cover to bring their atrocities or what they're going through into life. I wish that this thing could stop today, but the ways to bring about that end, it's the difficult way to find a way out there. So it's just sad, in short, to say.
Yes, it is, and the complexity that there in the war. So let me go back. Now we are coming to round two, which is we are getting to it now, talking about what should be done. But let's talk about the state of the current response, the local, the African Union, the international community. So Nazreen, let me go back to you. What is your assessment of the global response to the humanitarian or to the war situation? And you have worked with the local emergency inside the country, helping them with resources. But just compare the response between the local Sudanese themselves displaced and how the international community is trying to address it.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think we're all probably in the audience aware of the statistics that kind of define now the world's largest humanitarian displacement crisis. We've already talked about it a little bit. The close to, I think, 27 million people who are facing crisis levels of hunger in a country that could, of course, easily feed itself and the entire region. And I think, it's important to note that this famine, in my view, has been decades in the making. If we think of the billions that certainly Gulf elites, but also domestic agribusiness investors have kind of invested in acquiring Sudanese land to boost their own dairy and meat production, lands that small farmers and herders were dispossessed of by the former regime. I think that context is important. We also know that the healthcare system has largely collapsed. The last remaining hospital in Al Fashir, North Darfur, was recently shelled for the third time as nearby IDP camps are being attacked by both sides. We know that over 12 million people have been displaced, and many refugees are being denied the right to seek asylum, or in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, and as Dr. Abu Sharaf has mentioned, also now Chad, are being deported within the context of sometimes EU-funded border externalization policies, and no country that I'm aware of at least has issued a special expedited visa program for Sudanese refugees. And I think one of the contradictions, at least in the international media response, to this war has been an overemphasis on the humanitarian crisis the war has produced without ever mentioning the localized mutual aid networks that are leading these relief efforts. So we have about 700 plus emergency response rooms that emerged, some within days of the war starting, to fill a gap left behind by the international aid community that actually evacuated alongside myself as soon as the war began, and of course, by the absence of a civilian service providing state. The presence of international aid actors is still quite inadequate, and the relief effort has from the beginning of the war never been adequately funded by the international community. I think the last statistics for this fiscal year have shown that only 3% of it has been funded. And so I'll say, as a member of a diaspora group called the Sudan Solidarity Collective, we've been providing financial support to the emergency response rooms, but also to various unions like the Tea Vendors Union, the Jazeera and Managil Farmers Alliance, which recently actually launched a We Must Plant campaign, through which they're providing hundreds of rural families with seeds and inputs to plant subsistence foods inside their compounds, which is a campaign they hope to support people to replicate in other parts of the country like Darfur, but also Eastern Sudan, where displaced Sudanese farmers have fled to. And these emergency response rooms they're kind of separate from the resistance committees that I discussed earlier, but they very much emerged out of their structures and rely on the networks and relationships that they built to serve the needs of civilians with very little resources. And so what are they doing? They're basically organizing communal kitchens, they're driving ambulances, they're coordinating evacuations and protection activities, they're setting up ad hoc emergency clinics and rape crisis centers, they're converting defunct schools into shelters, they're evacuating people, they're repairing public services such as water and electricity, and they're also retrieving and burying dead bodies. Some are also organizing learning activities for some of the 19 million children that are out of school. They're providing psychosocial support to displaced people and running urban gardening projects. I think they're also critically challenging the intense polarization and militarization of civic life that we're witnessing right now, by building community across difference in the midst of kind of unimaginable violence. And so I want to end by saying I think there's a similar contradiction that exists in policy circles, as as Dr. Glade has pointed out to me as well, that policy analysts have been overemphasizing the security apparatus and armed parties in their analysis of this war, while often downplaying and marginalizing the critical role that non-elite civilian actors and organizers, such as the civilian volunteers leading these emergency response rooms, are playing to mitigate its impact. And I think reversing this will be critical for us to move towards peace. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tom, I want to come to you on the response. AFRECS as a faith-based organization and international organization responding to the disasters by war or whether it's famine. And so what has been the response by faith-based institutions such as AFRECS and others, and how does that compare to the local response?
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned, access is such a huge problem, and it's not just getting the supplies there, but actually managing the distribution, making sure it gets to the right people, and utilizing local networks. And as Nasreen was saying, one of the most important of those that is still able to function in Sudan is the ERRs and other mutual aid groups. So I know that a lot of organizations, including USAID and other international organizations, are increasingly relying on putting resources into those organizations, both for humanitarian and for what might not be called life-saving, but other critical interventions, as Nasreen was talking about. So those have become increasingly important. The problem is, of course, first of all, how do you get supplies to them or resources? Usually you have to, these days, try to use some financial transactions. But then, of course, their capacity is limited because they have to rely on the local market, which isn't working very well. So if we could get more in there, and I think we probably could do more in terms of humanitarian access and getting humanitarian resources there. Now, remember a few months ago when they were talking about Gaza, and Gaza needed 500 trucks a day. Remember, that was in the news. Well, that was for 2 million people. So for 25 million, how many trucks a day do you think that is? It's thousands and thousands. But we can still do something, and I think there's a couple of things we could do. One is the UN has recently gotten permission to set up a couple of airport bases, Damazin, El Obeid, allowing to bring in UN flights. We could build on that, okay, and move forward, take advantage of that, actually put in staff and then work from there. I think the UN could be much more forward-leaning in taking advantage of that. Also working on maybe corridors. If you can't get, full access, you can at least get corridors to get the supplies in. So I think more of that can be done. But relying on these local mutual aid groups is going to be critical. And I think that's, they're doing amazing work in the midst of very dangerous circumstances, and we need to find ways to support them as much as we can.
And thank you for pointing. I was going to ask that very question as a follow-up to you, but you just mentioned, is there a lesson that can be learned from the local response by the international community, and how can we partner together? Rogea, I'm coming back to you on the mention of humanitarian corridors and the point you mentioned earlier about difficulty of the people to even get out to go to other countries because they are blocked to do so, and that increased the rate of death. And you mentioned what happened in Wahad Medani, where now this is the first spillover, the violent spillover that could go to where the SAF massacred the South Sudanese because they were displaced there and they could not have access to get out. So what should be done in terms of humanitarian corridors or how people get to escape the ongoing death?
Oops, muted.
Yeah.
You muted.
Thank you, John. This is a difficult question, and as made clear by Nisreen and Tom, that in the total lack of some mechanism to try even to get these corridors underway, it would be difficult but worth trying. I also agree with Nisreen's point about the local initiatives. We have to remember that the local initiatives and Ligan al-Muqawama and the resistance committees and neighborhood committees that started back in 2013 were key makers of the revolution that unfortunately had been stolen. We have to talk about how, for example, in neighboring areas, in border regions like Darfur and Gadarif and so on, and the Blue Nile, if you can get these neighboring states to work, for example, to coordinate with the local, I don't know how we can imagine aid getting to the people without, in spite of all of these obstacles.
Alex, what do we do about that? And to that point, in terms of the looming and the ongoing famine, you have researched and done a lot about famine in East Africa, in the region itself. How does this compare to previous famine? And because we want to highlight this also to our audience and people that may not be familiar with what is going on here, and that's the purpose, raising awareness in order to be able to do something.
So elements of this famine are very familiar. Like all previous famines in Sudan over the last 40 years, it has multiple causes, but the key to the scale of the suffering, the intensity, and the difficulties of resolving it, of relieving it, are human action, political action. I think it resembles the war famines in South Sudan in one very important respect, which is that during the 80s and 90s, the famines came about because of counterinsurgency run by the generals of the Sudan Armed Forces, and their use of proxies and their obstruction of relief. And in their minds, and they will say this sometimes quite explicitly, the great mistake they made from their point of view was Operation Lifeline Sudan. It was allowing the UN into the south because that brought resources in that sustained the civilian population in the south when they sought to depopulate it. Some of those resources, let us be frank, ended up in the hands of SPLA, though not as many, of course, as were alleged by the then government of Sudan. But it also allowed people like us into South Sudan, and it created an international community that saw what was happening and expressed solidarity with the people of South Sudan. And from the point of view of those generals, once the humanitarian nose of the camel got into the tent, the body followed, and the result was the independence of the South. That is their narrative. Now, we would, I think, all disagree with that narrative. But they see that as a mistake, and they do not want to make that mistake again with the RSF. And I think we need to very candidly understand that. And I think the United Nations made a grave error in recognizing General Burhan and the Sudan Armed Forces as the government of Sudan, and really getting nothing in return for that. So that on the border with Chad, smugglers, arms dealers cross it every day. There is not a Sudanese soldier within hundreds of miles. The only people who have to respect that border are the United Nations. And I think that's absurd. The African Union is in an interesting position here, because although it has actually is a far weaker, very poorly led institution and has been for the last decade or so. There's a leadership election coming up, and there can't be any less energetic leadership of the African Union. So hopefully the more energetic leadership will apply itself to Sudan. And it has two cards that it can play, which I think are very important. Number one is Sudan has not been readmitted to the AU. And the African Union is coming under a lot of pressure to readmit Sudan, especially pressure from Egypt. And there should be some conditions attached to any such readmission. And the second is the African Union is the only entity that might be willing to put boots on the ground, might actually be willing to have some sort of civilian protection, monitoring, or even protection mission. And the United Nations isn't going to do it. So there is a slender opening there, because this humanitarian tragedy will not be alleviated without some measures towards civilian protection and protection of humanitarians. The humanitarians simply cannot do it on their own.
Well, thank you. Now we describe the gravity of the situation, how the response are not adequate. To you, Rebecca and Guy, I want to start the next round, which is on what should be done. What is a path forward here? So let me make a few points, and then all of you will take turn, and then we come back to the audience. Thank you for being patient online and in person. In 2020, Sudan was removed from the terrorism list by the U.S. government in exchange to pay more than $300 million to the victim of U.S. terrorism that happened caused by where Sudan was a part of. And that happened in 2020. You mentioned earlier the African Union removed Sudan also, and talking about readmission. As you talk about what needs to be done, so have those in mind. And then we are talking to an audience. Some of them are concerned because they have people back home there, and they are watching. But to the outsiders, the question is, what is in it for us? Why should we care? And so let's talk about this in our recommendation. Let me start with you, Rebecca. What are your recommendations, given what you think are the assumptions that are misplaced and what is not working? Talk about 1 to 2 key assumptions, key recommendations on what should be done as a way forward.
Sure. So I think that any question of what the U.S. or any outside actor should be doing with regards to this war needs to be framed by the nature of the war as a counter-revolutionary war, and the question of the leverage that powers, including the U.S., have in it. And I think it's become clear that the U.S.'s leverage on warring parties in Sudan is fairly limited. It has more leverage over regional powers that are funding this war and have leverage over the warring parties, but the U.S. itself couldn't even convince the warring parties to have a ceasefire long enough to evacuate its citizens at the outbreak of war. And if we look at the track record with regards to the peace talks, as well as even negotiating access for humanitarian aid, we see that it's pretty limited. And understanding that and thinking about the U.S.'s limited ability to affect Sudanese actors directly, I think my focus, and the focus that I think best befits outsiders at this point, is one of ensuring the survival of as many civilians as possible, and in the process, the survival of as many institutions that serve civilians, which includes institutions of higher education, as well as existing healthcare facilities, labor unions, cooperatives, and associations, and which are non-state but have become crucial for the survival of civilians. Ultimately, when and how this war ends is going to be determined by political considerations and a global political economy feeding the warring parties. It's all indeterminate, but what we do know is that ERRs and grassroots activists are keeping civilians safe to the extent that's possible. We do know that civilians still need basic services and that young people still need education. That is true now, and it will be even more true when this war ends. It's much easier to build upon already existing institutions rather than starting from scratch. Before the outbreak of war, there were 39 state universities with over 14,000 university lecturers. More than half of them had PhDs. The lives of those lecturers and students was massively disrupted, with some dying, others displaced. Supporting these lecturers and their students materially and the institutions they come from not only benefits the roughly 1 million university students who are studying in Sudan at the outbreak of war, but also helps to ensure the durability of these institutions when the war ends, helping to prevent brain drain and ensure the availability of professionals to help in the rebuilding process and ensure the education of the next generation.
Thank you. Guy, based on your lived experience and whatever you know in terms of how ineffective the current response or what is being missed by the outsiders, what are your key recommendations on what should be done?
I think what really needs to be done, a complete change of military regime in the country, because logically it only makes sense that military is just an institution within country, and you cannot have a country to the military regime or a system to lead the whole country. Now, there is a huge division within Sudanese. For example, there are those who are from West. It's not really easy to convince them to accept somebody who is from the North to represent them or to speak on their behalf. There is this internal division. The only thing that I think that really needs to be done, and I'm not certain if you guys are reading or not, there is a steps of new formation of a new government. Maybe, and I'm saying maybe, that would be the right body that the external supporters could cooperate with that government. This is only if it gets established, because it's kind of hard today for us as Sudanese to really allow the military regime to rule another Sudan. I think it is a time for Sudan to move forward, but and not backward. Also, I want to make a point on Sudan being on the list of instead of sponsoring terrorism. I think it's pretty normal, and it's likely to place Sudan again back on that list, because the activities that are currently taking place in Sudan are completely terrorist activities, and also those who are killing innocent civilians are people from ISIS, and with help from the government of Sudan, they are included within the Sudanese military and killing innocent civilians. This needs to be clear, and most generally, to have a healthy Sudan. I think the formation of a new government or a system that every Sudanese agrees on would be essential. Otherwise, we're going to have a multiple Sudan, which is something we don't want to see. I would add to that.
Thank you. Thank you. Rogea, what are your key thoughts moving forward in terms of recommendations?
Thinking across the region, there is, by way of just highlighting networking with regional organizations who are trying to highlight and do something about the plight of sexual violence survivors. The Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa has a very strong civil society impact. They have been documenting the scale of the violence, and not only that, but also doing their best to network with, to the best of their ability, with people on the ground who encounter these survivors of gang rapes, of forced pregnancies, and unexpected pregnancies, and so on. So I think that could also be a factor. In the past, we worked at the Kennedy School of Government with Ambassador Swanee Hunt, who actually recognized the importance of the locals. So what happened was she tried to get as many people as possible who lived, for example, in the Sudan. She had a big network of people from displaced and conflict-riven places to try to speak also to stakeholders in the US in an effort to be able to have some effect on the ground. And I think it was really important because we used to have always updates and the follow-up and the vetting and so on. So if there is something by way of supporting people who are closest to making a difference in the community, I think that that would be great.
Thank you.
The other thing about the spillover effect, I don't, if Burhan, who made it clear that he is not going to negotiate and that he's going to settle this militarily, and we know that is not going to happen, at least maybe conversations or talking with the neighbors. Egypt right now has to worry about the Renaissance Dam and the water politics and the water security. So the point is that what happens in the Sudan is not staying in the Sudan and will not stay in the Sudan. The Red Sea factor that Alex talked about is crucial because there was also a conversation or a rumor, we can't differentiate anymore from the lies, from the truth. But the Russian interest in the Red Sea and the military bases, you have the Saudis, you have the Emiratis. So the Red Sea politics itself as something that is also affecting and really interlacing different ecologies from all over the world. We have seen right now what is happening, for example, in the Red Sea. So that is, again, this is important. If you can't get the criminals to stop and have some semblance of compassion, then we have to talk to the neighbors, engage with them.
Thank you. Nasreen, you are teaching in Canada, of course, and how is the US, Canada, and others address this situation? What are your recommendations?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I will admit that I'm sort of largely of the mind that there's been too much negative forms of external meddling and intervention, and that even some of the more positive forms of intervention, whether they're sanctions against the RSF and army held companies or even attempts to broker peace, have been largely too late or ineffective. In the case of the kind of high-level peace talks in Jeddah and Geneva, I think they've in some ways served to greenlight the continuation of this war by once again centering and legitimizing military elites at the expense of non-elite civilian actors who represent those actually experiencing the catastrophe of this war. And I think it's important to actually hold any kind of future peace talks in the region because the regional actors are more invested in, in peace given the spillover effect. I think also partly because of Clinton-era sanctions, as others have mentioned, and Sudan's kind of long status as a pariah state, the US has lost much of its leverage vis-a-vis military leaders in Sudan. The external actors in this war, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, but also regional actors like Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Russia on both sides, have more leverage. And the US could use the leverage it does have vis-a-vis its allies among them to, for instance, pressure the Emirates into halting its support of the RSF by stopping arms sales to the UAE. Like one of the things that I think we haven't really talked about too much is that, people generally have been talking about the gold trade and its role in this war. We haven't talked as much about the livestock trade. Livestock exports have increased by about 77% to Saudi Arabia, for example, in the first year of the war. Al-Burhan is allegedly helping Sisi in Egypt keep the cost of meat low through Sudanese livestock. And the irony is that the RSF and army have created safe corridors for livestock traders to move thousands of animals across their territories to export terminals along the Red Sea and the border with Egypt, while deliberately obstructing such corridors for humanitarian aid and for people fleeing violence. So essentially, as Sudanese people starve, livestock exports to Saudi Arabia and Egypt are increasing and are becoming a critical and steady source of revenue for both parties. And again, this shows us that they're perfectly capable of creating these corridors if they wish, right? And I think that's where leverage from the U.S. And in Canada, which also sells arms, for example, to the UAE, can come into place. I think there's also a critical need for humanitarian aid and support. At this moment, on January 24th, I think, the State Department announced that it would freeze most foreign aid programs. And the think tank Fikra actually issued a statement detailing the potential impact this could have on local emergency response rooms. Our collective has raised over $500,000 for these emergency response rooms and other civilian-led efforts. And sadly, a lot of them have told us that the funds that the USAID has pledged to them before the freeze, that very little of that has actually made it on the ground because of the sort of bureaucratic red tape that has, held this up, and also because of some of the problems I think that are inherent to the ways large international aid agencies function. So I think not only does the international community need to adequately fund the relief effort, it also needs to ensure that it gets to those who most need it in a timely way and in a way that responds to local needs, and civilian-led mutual aid networks are key to facilitating this. I also think people should support, international actors can support, people to farm. And I think farmers and herders and their needs should be centered in any kind of peace process that follows, because, about 60 to 70% of Sudan's population still relies on agriculture to make a living. And then finally, this is my final point, I think we need the US and other countries to create a robust refugee visa program that adequately responds to the world's largest displacement crisis. Here in Canada, we have a financially prohibitive and highly bureaucratic, slightly expanded family reunification program standing in for a refugee program that could be modeled after the response to Ukraine, such that right now, actually in Canada, the ratio of Ukrainian to Sudanese refugees admitted is 1 to 100, or 300,000 to less than 3,000. In the US, TPS has been temporary protected status has been extended for Sudanese refugees, but in my view, that's not nearly enough. There need to be paths to citizenship for TPS holders, and we need free expedited refugee visa programs for Sudanese refugees, modeled after the Uniting for Ukraine program that was sadly just suspended by this administration. And I realize this is all probably a pipe dream given the current context in Washington, but I firmly believe that we need to ask for what we need and not for what we think we will get. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Alex, what should be done by the new administration and Congress?
So there are many things that the other panelists have said need to be done, and I agree and support with them all. So I won't use up time repeating them. I think we need to be realistic that if there is to be serious progress towards a deal between the main belligerents, that will come about because of wider developments across the Middle East, in which the Sudan will, an agreement, a ceasefire or a peace process in Sudan will be a byproduct of that. Now, the downside of that is that it will be another power-sharing deal amongst those who created the problem in the first place. And I think we just need to face that as a very likely reality. I think we would all wish that it were otherwise, but that's the likely reality. The key card that the one thing that the Sudanese civilians have done in the last 6-7 years is they have shown they hold the card to legitimacy. And the generals know that. Everyone knows that the only legitimate government will be one that is a civilian government. So that card needs to be held and played. And some process of consensus building among the civilians needs to be promoted. And that's extraordinarily difficult. Efforts have been made, and obviously they're not they're not going terribly far at the moment. But I think we just need to fasten on to that, hold on to that key point that going beyond the power sharing sort of negative peace to a real peace requires that civilian legitimacy.
Thank you. Tom, you informed by your career in the public service and your civil society work. Take it away. What is the path forward?
Yeah, very, very difficult, obviously. You know, in a way, when you look at the two belligerents, they have no incentive to stop fighting, because once they do, it's very likely they'll either be assassinated or imprisoned. So, you know, I would love to see the two of them come together and come to an agreement, but that's not going to happen, I think, unless a lot of pressure is put, and not just on them, but on their supporters. We need to think more about how do we put pressure on those who are supporting the two sides. And one issue just to throw out there, that maybe it's a pipe dream or whatever. In a way, when you think of it, the supporting countries, groups, or whatever are pretty much all Arab, Muslim. So maybe we need to address that from an Arab Muslim perspective rather than an African, or at least both. So not only the African Union, but maybe the Arab League. We need to, you know, engage with them and find some ways for the Middle East to Arab Islamic communities to come and put pressure on the two sides. Sudan has a long history of very strong civil society, especially women, frankly. And I think they can play and will play a very important role. Now, that does mean that they need to get themselves organized. There's lots of discussions going on. You mentioned Taqaddum as one of them, but there are others, and they need to make sure that they can come together, and both to put pressure on the warring parties, but also to come up with a plan so that if and when there is some sort of a peace, that they have a civilian government, a civilian plan to step in and figure out how they're going to do it. I think that's going to be critical. On the purely humanitarian side, I do think the UN needs to be more aggressive, more, you know, less risk averse. Okay, as you mentioned, Alex, you know, the UN won't allow trucks to come in from Chad because the government in Port Sudan says they can't, even though there's no government troops anywhere nearby. They need to blow through that, okay, and allow both UN trucks, but also other NGOs and whoever to go through. So that's, and then, as I mentioned, they already have permission to put in air flights into places like Damazin and El Obeid, and they need to expand on that, take advantage of those, and kind of like you mentioned with OLS, Alex, once you get those on the ground, that creates an opening. That creates people there who see what's going on. And that's another thing, we need more press coverage. You know, it's the forgotten thing, part of it is press coverage. Now, it's not easy to get in there because of security access and so on, but if there's a way we can get more press in there, you know, you hate to use the picture of starving babies, but that might help to get attention and then more pressure put on the sides. So it's not easy. It has to come from all angles, but it's so important. We need to put a heck of a lot more focus and attention on Sudan.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the panelists, and we have very few minutes left, but we want. There has been questions, and our speakers have just put their thoughts forward. If there is a burning question, something that was not even touched, okay, raise your hand and then just go direct to the question so that we can answer it in time. Thank you. Just say your name and then the question.
Sure. Nicole Wittersheim with Human Rights Watch. We're getting there after an hour and so about the elephant in the room that there's been a U.S. aid suspension. And the U.S. has been the biggest donor to Sudan for over, 30 years or something. But what I don't hear you, and Tom, I know you from my time in USAID, but what what I'm concerned about is that even when it's every administration's prerogative to do a review, and they should when they're spending billions of dollars to make sure it's effective and it's getting to the people in need. But when this review is done in 80 days, we're still going to have to make the case for those that want to see humanitarian assistance and development assistance and assistance to the ERRs, and in particular, the assistance to the women who've been victims of sexual violence, because that one's going to be one of the first ones that doesn't pass the review. We're going to have to make a case that this is going to make America stronger, more secure, and it's an American first policy to spend $4 billion in the last 4 years in Sudan. So I wanted to ask, because I didn't hear that fully articulated, what is that case? I hate to be so American, but we're sitting in the same building with USAID, and it's the largest donor. So maybe it's a donor diversity issue, but I just would love to hear, how do we make that case? Because we have to make it now, not in 80 days when a full termination comes.
Maybe Alex and Tom, you can take that. How do we make the case on this situation, and how is Sudan in the best interest of the U.S.?
I think President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi ought to be the one that makes this case. I think he has the ear of the president. I think you get my drift. I don't need to say any more.
Yeah, I might add to that. Several people have mentioned the Red Sea, okay, and that's a key waterway for so many countries, for commerce, for security, and we see what's happening in Yemen, and there's interest that we've heard from Russia, from Iran, from others to have bases along the Red Sea. I would think that should be of interest to America, okay? And then, of course, there's humanitarian needs, obviously, but those are spreading to the neighboring countries, causing instability throughout the region. And that may actually end up with more refugees coming to Europe, even trying to come to America. So those kind of things should be of interest to us as well. It's a tough case because America is preoccupied, let's say, by Gaza, by Ukraine, and by other issues. But I think this one also has a huge import. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. One other burning, and then we'll close. All right.
Hi, my name is Dawit. I'm from Eritrea. I have just a quick comment and question regarding the global responses. The issue of refugee has not been discussed much. I didn't hear that. We talked a lot about inside Sudan, but refugees outside Sudan who are leaving and uprooted and moving to neighboring countries. I recently visited Eritrea. I know in Eritrea the government has a policy of not building refugee shelters, refugee villages, and encourage everybody, all Eritreans, to open their door and to let all the Sudanese to come to welcome Sudanese. I myself have seen some Sudanese family live in my family house. So how do you see that kind of approach, and especially all the neighboring countries, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Chad, and all that, in terms of the refugees?
Can one of you take that question, our virtual speakers, and then Nisreen, Rebecca? Yeah, Rebecca.
Yeah, I think that neighboring countries are a really important part of this, as about 3 million Sudanese are displaced outside of Sudan right now, most of whom are displaced regionally. And the status of Sudanese in these countries varies significantly. You described in Eritrea the policy, which has been one of the most generous ones. Meanwhile, in, say, Egypt, the border has been largely closed for all regular movement. And then you have a lot of people who are facing a crackdown with the closure of Sudanese schools and the prevention of Sudanese from getting jobs, and some even deported back to Sudan. In other countries, it varies significantly, but it creates real impediments. And one of the things, that could happen, that could be useful is working with regional powers to allow for those who are there to be regularized, to be received in a way and gain access particularly to jobs, to opportunities, so that they can live their lives and don't have to be concerned for day-to-day life and stability as they adjust to this horrible moment.
Well, we are out of time. Apologies, there are questions online or here, but we have to stop there. Please allow me and join me in thanking our speakers for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I want to thank our online audience and in-person audience for their patience. You can see the interest in the subject here. So thank you to you for coming here. And you have a lot to unpack from the panel. So go forth and utilize the information you get, and our common bond as human beings make us discuss things even from people that are far away from our home. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.